Dolby Vision, HDR10, Hybrid Log Gamma, PQ, Rec 2020 and Rec 2100. You will hear all these terms in relation to just one single topic, HDR. Getting your video uploaded in HDR to YouTube isn't that simple, but after watching this video you should be able to shoot, master and deliver in HDR without any problem. And to prove that, this video is recorded and uploaded in HDR. I want this video to be a beginner's guide, so I'm not gonna go into like super scientific details of every single topic. I want you to be able to understand it. So let's begin. What is HDR? The term HDR refers to high dynamic range. But what is it exactly? Let's take a look at these two shots, one in HDR and one in SDR. Well, the video shot in HDR has way more highlight detail, and that's basically it. The HDR packs way more light information precisely in highlights to make the image look more natural and, well, better looking. So now we get to the second big topic. How is this achieved? In order to get an HDR video, we need to use a proper color space and gamma. You can think of a color space as a pack of crayons. You can draw a nice picture with just a few of them, but if you add more colors that you didn't have before, you can get a more natural looking picture. Now on to the HDR formats. There are a few of them, but most popular are HDR10 with its Plus variant, Dolby Vision, HLG. HDR format handles mapping brightness and color values onto your display and is there to make sure that the thing you see on your TV is as close to the reference grade as possible. All the formats above use PQ as the transfer function, except HLG, which is both a transfer function and a format in itself. All you need to worry about right now is that HLG makes the video backwards compatible with SDR displays without the need for separate color grade for it. If you upload to YouTube in PQ, you don't have to worry about that because YouTube will automatically transform your HDR into SDR, but it can be hit or miss. So let's talk about things you need for getting it done. Shooting in HDR became way more accessible thanks to Apple and their implementation of HDR with Dolby Vision in the previous years. But if you want to have a better looking image with more control over it, we need a compatible camera. It needs to shoot in at least 10 bits, otherwise it cannot reproduce accurate colors. It also needs to shoot in log or HLG. In my case, I use Sony a7 IV, which shoots both in log and HLG. I'll stick to S-Log because it's way easier for me to convert it to HLG and PQ, and is way more flexible than HLG. But hold on a second. I didn't say anything about log before, didn't I? Well, yeah, because you don't deliver HDR in log, with a small exception of HLG in which you can shoot and deliver. We use log for capturing and compressing light information into a smaller container, allowing us to create high dynamic range shots and display them on any color space we choose. After you shot your first video in HDR, it's time to master it. My recommendation for HDR work is DaVinci Resolve. I'm going to be using a paid version and I strongly recommend getting it. After all, it's a one-time payment and you keep it forever. Paid version adds support for HDR10+, Dolby Vision and other HDR standards, and some other cool features for HDR workflow. From my research, the free version doesn't support HDR, so you actually need some more upfront cost, but I would say that DaVinci is actually worth it. You can of course use Premiere Pro or Final Cut or any other NLE that supports HDR, but I'm going to cover only Premiere Pro and DaVinci Resolve in this tutorial, since I'm not super familiar with Final Cut, and I am going to cover it on both Windows and macOS because some things are a bit different on these two. Feel free to use the chapter function and find the workflow of your choice. So before we continue, I want to thank my sponsor, which is myself. If you enjoyed this video so far, leave a like, subscribe, there is more to come. So now, let's talk about the additional hardware we actually need to master in HDR. But first and foremost, you need an HDR display that can actually display true HDR signal. Regular LCDs won't cut it, I'm sorry. You need a display that can achieve high brightness, support at least 10 bits, and feature some sort of local dimming that will allow you to see the full range of your picture. I have recently purchased the Alienware AW3423DW that features QD OLED panel and has a 1000 nit peak brightness and feature, well, infinite local dimming zones because it is an OLED display. It is on the pricey side, but if we compare it to like professional displays that are in the studios like this one, or this Asus ProArt that already costs like 4 or 5 times more, then it starts to become more of a bargain. Now, you got your fancy HDR monitor, you just open your program, click some settings, and boom, you have your HDR, right? Well, yes and no. Due to how graphics cards work in conjunction with your operating system, it is super hard to get a precise, live picture from your editing software. It's not impossible anymore, but it depends on your setup. You either need something that bypasses your graphic cards and your OS's color management system, or you need to set everything properly in your software and hope for the best. The device in question is called the I/O card, input-output card. There are many brands that produce them, but I would highly recommend getting the one from Blackmagic Design because it is the only one that will work in Resolve, and it is gonna work in any other software that you choose. So I left my recommendations below if you want to get them. If you don't want to splurge on the I/O card but you already own an HDR display, you can get HDR inside Premiere, but not in Resolve. In Premiere, when creating new project, you need to select proper color space. Let's select Rec 2100 PQ. In video preview section, check maximum bit depth and maximum render quality. Then go to general settings and select display color management. Now, things that display in your program window should be displayed correctly if you actually own an HDR compatible display, of course. One quick note though, my monitor is an OLED. So I in practice have an infinite amount of local dimming zones. I do not guarantee that the things you will see on your program monitor, if you don't have massive amount of local dimming zones, will appear correctly or on correct brightness. So take it with a grain of salt if you only have one monitor, or put your program monitor solely on your HDR display, then it should work properly. If you're using Resolve on Windows, there are ways to cheat your way into the HDR. Well, if you own an HDR display, you just have to render out what you've made, watch it in VLC or any other compatible player, and do your adjustments. If you have a phone that supports HDR, you can render out your video, upload it to YouTube or put it on your Plex server and watch it on your phone, do your adjustments, that's it. I still strongly recommend getting an I/O card if you really want to deep dive into the HDR business, since it's the only fully reliable way. If you're on macOS and use Resolve, just go to Resolve settings and enable display HDR on viewers if available. Enable use Mac display color profiles for viewers and you're good to go. In Resolve, after you start the project, go to its settings, choose resolution and frame rate. Select 10 bits in bit depth section and check Enable HDR metadata. Then go to Color Management tab. Change it to DaVinci Y RGB Color Managed. Deselect Automatic Color Management and under Color Processing Mode, choose HDR DaVinci White Gamut Intermediate. In Output Color Space, choose Rec 2100 ST 2084 Scene. Now you're ready to work in HDR. So now let's talk about some things that you need to know about the HDR video that will make your experience better and help you make better content. HDR is not about being bright. This one might seem a bit counterintuitive, but making your scene just bright won't make it look better or be good. You should not focus on making something bright just for the sake of it being bright. But what about the scenes that are shot in broad daylight, you may ask? They're naturally all nice and bright, and yeah, but that doesn't mean you should exceed the average brightness of 100 nits anyways. The HDR standard has the viewing brightness of less than 5 nits, so there's no need to push it beyond 100 nits anyway, because it's just going to be painful to watch. Let the HDR be reserved for like specular highlights and just let it spice up your image, not just dominate it or overwhelm it. To back this up a little, let's take a look at these movies. In Blade Runner 2049, the opening scenes are almost pure whites, yet they never exceed more than 100 nits despite the film being mastered on a 10,000 nit display. And now let's see a bit more extreme case, fully depicting what HDR is about. In Interstellar, we can see this scene where main characters fly by a black hole. In this shot, almost whole frame is filled with brightness, getting close to 1000 nit on whole display. But it's not how it's done everywhere in this movie. It is used specifically to highlight how bright and overwhelming the object in reality is. Just few shots later, the whole scene is at below 10 nits, with its highlights at around 100 nits. But when the engines are disabled, or in our case fired up to make it easier for you to see, peak brightness of them shoots up to 1000 nits. So in conclusion, don't put too much brightness into your shots. You should also know that the workflow we have picked is color space aware. What does it mean? When importing your footage, whether it's Resolve or Premiere, after you import it, the program is going to try and read file's color space and assign it correctly. Most of the time, especially with S-Log footage, it's not going to do a good job, so you have to point it manually. That's why you must assign the proper color space and gamma to the clip. Thankfully, you can do it in batches in both Premiere and Resolve. In Resolve, select all your clips with the same color space, right-click on them, hover over Input Color Space, and select correct one. Since we're in a color-managed project, Resolve is going to perform automatic color space transforms to make everything fit perfectly. In Premiere, you can also select all the clips with the same color space, hover over Modify, and click on Interpret Footage. Then, at the very bottom, under Color Management, select Color Space Override and select the proper color space and gamma combo. You may notice that Premiere has fewer options, and sadly there is not much you can do. You can aid yourself with conversion LUTs, but please bear in mind that using LUT isn't the same as using proper color transform functions that are literally mathematical equations. So now when you finished color correcting and grading your video, it's time to export it. YouTube has its own set of recommendations and guides, but they're not super clear, so I'm just going to straight up tell you what to set to make it look and work on YouTube. In Premiere Pro, head to Export tab. In Format Selection, choose HEVC H.265. Select Render at maximum bit depth and use maximum render quality. In Profile Selection, select Main 10, set Export Color Space to Rec 2100 PQ. You don't have to select the option to include HDR10 metadata. I have uploaded some test shots to YouTube and this option is absolutely not required. YouTube will just chuck the file absolutely fine. However, since you don't embed this data, there is no information on what display you mastered your content on, and the HDR experience may be broken or absolutely horrible on anything than YouTube itself. If you do decide to enable this option, your encoding will be switched to software encoding, which is done by your CPU and not your GPU. And since your CPU is doing all the work, and if you have a worse hardware, it will take significantly more time to render with software than with hardware. And after you select to include the HDR10 metadata, you should choose your color primaries as Rec 2020. Then you should specify what the peak luminance of your mastering display was. You can leave average as it is, then set your bitrate properly, preferably around 30 or 40, set the quality to good, and you're good to go. Press render. In Resolve, head to the Deliver tab. In Format, you can choose QuickTime or MP4 as you please. In Codec, select H.265 as an encoder, choose the fastest option on your system. It will probably NVIDIA or AMD, I don't know. It's your system. Select Export and embed HDR10 metadata. In quality, set it to restricted up to like 40,000 for 4K or 25,000 for 1080p. Set encoding profile to main 10, add to render queue, press render, and well, that's it. Now, few words about uploading to YouTube, since their process isn't very indicative of what they're actually doing with your video. Generally, the upload process looks exactly the same as the normal video. Just drag and drop it to YouTube, wait for it to process, and well, publish, right? Up until the last moment, you will not see any indication that your video has been recognized as HDR and processed as HDR. And worry not, the HDR tag will come after the full quality process, like up to 4K, then it will start processing the HDR. Also, when we're on the processing topic, it can take literal days for YouTube to process your video in HDR. That was the beginner tutorial to getting your video uploaded in HDR to YouTube. I hope that you liked it. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a comment. What did you like? If you didn't, please leave a comment what you didn't like and what should be changed in this video. Be sure to subscribe because more content about HDR videos and about cameras and everything else is coming down the way. So yeah, that's it. Thank you. Bye.